Good afternoon. This meeting of the Rent Board is called to order at 5:02 p.m.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the November 17th, 2021 regular meeting of the Richmond Rent Board. Before we begin with an open session to hear public comment before closed session, I will go over a few reminders about public comments. Members of the public were asked to submit requests to speak on any item on the agenda, including their name, phone number, and item for which they wish to make a public comment to Cynthia_Shaw at ci.richmond.ca.us by 3 p.m. today, as described on the first page of the agenda. If you wish to make a public comment on any item on the agenda and have not emailed me your request, you must do so in accordance with the first page of the agenda before the item is called. Requests received via email during the meeting and after the deadline to submit comments will be accommodated as is reasonably possible and will be limited to a maximum of 1 to 2 minutes, depending on the number of commenters, as more fully described in the Rent Board meeting agenda procedures. This meeting is being conducted as a Zoom webinar. Members of the public are considered attendees and will be muted for the duration of the meeting unless called upon during public comment and unmuted by the webinar host. The city cannot guarantee that its network and/or the site will be uninterrupted. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and all statements made during this webinar will be on public record. Okay, the first item on the agenda is the roll call. For the purpose of the Audible, for the purpose of the recording, now an Audible roll call for Rent Board members and staff. Board Member Connor.
Present.
Yes.
Welcome.
Welcome. Board Member Johnson.
Present.
Board Member Vasilas.
Present.
Vice Chair Misha.
Present.
Yes, she got the link too. Chair Finley.
Here.
Okay. Executive Director Nicholas Taylor.
Here.
Deputy Director Fred Tran. I think he's on the other link, so I'm going to say absent. Staff Attorney Charles Oshanuka.
Here.
And let the record show that Mr. Tran is here.
Yes, I will. For the record, all board members are present and all staff members are present. For Deputy Director Fred Tran is present, however, he's on another link for our closed session. All right, the next item on the agenda is public comment before closed session. The purpose of open session is for the Rent Board to hear public comments on the following items to be discussed in closed session. Tonight, the closed session item for discussion is conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, significant exposure to litigation pursuant to paragraph 2 of subdivision D, subdivision E5 of Government Code section 54956.9, subject to subdivision F of Government Code section 54956.9, contemporaneous record of threat of litigation. Tonight we have one speaker. The speaker shall be allowed up to 2 minutes to address the board. When your name is called, please wait until the webinar host lets you know that you have been unmuted. For the record, please state your name and your residence is optional. Please terminate your address to the board when your time expires. We ask that you keep your comments respectful and appropriate. You will be muted when your time expires. The only speaker for public comment before closed session is Alexis Gavorgian. And Mr. Gavorgian, just a second, let me let you in. You can go ahead now, Mr. Gavorgian.
Hello, can you hear me and see me?
We can hear you. I can see if I can undo your video. I think you only, we only can hear you.
Oh, can you do it so you could see me too?
Let me promote you to a panelist and that might help. 1 second.
Thank you. Join as attendee or panelist?
I just upgraded you to a panelist, so you should be able to do your video now. You're on the screen.
Right.
There you are. We see you now. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate giving me the opportunity to speak before you today. And I've shared a letter that our attorney has shared with the board. And the issue is that of the annual monitoring fee that's being imposed on our project. We have a major affordable housing project in the city on Nevin, right near the BART line. And we respectfully object to the method of calculation that they are imposing on us. There are a few reasons why we cannot pay this fee. Reason number one is that our lenders do a re-underwriting of our entire loan, and our loan becomes far less than what we originally forecasted, and it has a huge impact on affordable housing. Additionally, our project has several layers of oversight by the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, the state of California, as well as several other federal laws. And unlike a small project where if it was a 5-unit or 10-unit project, the fees that you impose are reasonable given the size. Our project, however, is very large, and we also carry the burden of having 3 on-site property managers, all of whom follow the fair housing rules, including tenant selection, evictions. We have all kinds of agreements and regulatory requirements that we need to comply with, and we're also willing to comply with your agency's rules and regulations also. So the fact that we have, say, 250 units doesn't mean we should be paying 250 times more than what a 1-unit or a 5-unit project has.
Your time has expired unless they allow additional time.
Can I get an additional time?
It's up to the board chair.
If it's all right with the other board members, I will give you an additional 5 minutes, and then that will have to suffice.
Thank
Other
you.
board members, is that all right with you? Just say yes or no.
Yes.
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 Okay, please give the speaker an additional 5 minutes.
All right.
Thank you, Chairman. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. So we are not, we own and manage approximately 10,000 apartment units. Not a single one is in default. Not a single one do we have ongoing litigation with tenants. We always hire third-party managers. We have 2 to 3 on-site managers that make sure that all of our tenants are treated fairly. We are not opposed to paying a reasonable fee to your agency. We just believe that, unlike, for example, other fees in the city of Richmond and other cities near Richmond, for example, fire impact fees or any type of monitoring fees, there's a sliding scale. It's not a linear relationship between the number of units that you have and your fees. So in order for your agency to monitor us, it doesn't take you, for example, 100 times more effort. So there's just a general rule of thumb and a concept of being full pass-through of whatever your costs are. We have no objections to paying your costs. We just object to this being a profit center that pays for other projects that are not paying into the fund. We're also willing to pay more than what is reasonable from the standpoint of you recovering all of your expenses. And we'd like to ask the board to work with us in good faith to resolve this situation without resorting to litigation, because ultimately we're gonna, next year, there's gonna be another assessment on us, and we're gonna have to appeal it again. We would much rather work with you in good faith to not only give you a reasonable fee, but we're willing to give you slightly more than what we think is reasonable to cover all your costs. We're also willing to provide you with the 5,000 units that we own so you could verify that we are not bad landlords. And by imposing these fees, all that is really happening is that you're reducing the affordable housing funds that are available, because our funds are underwritten, including your fees or without them. So when you include the fees in there, it reduces the permanent loan to the tune of $1 or $2 million, depending on the size of the project. And you're hurting affordable housing. You're hurting the tenants. You're not helping them. So with that, I'm hoping that you'll take this under advisement and ask your attorney to negotiate with us in good faith so that we can avoid litigation. That's really all I have to say. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions for the speaker?
Can we ask questions of the speaker?
I was
Is
gonna
that
ask.
You know,
Charles, are they able to ask the speaker questions?
I beg your pardon? Cynthia, what did you just say?
I asked Mr. Oceanuga, are the board members available, are you able to ask questions to the person, to the public comment?
You typically don't during public comment because it's not a hearing. However, it's not illegal. You certainly can if you want.
You know, I realize that we typically don't, but this is a rather unusual situation. And having been on the Planning Commission for many years, we were allowed to ask questions. Certainly the City Council allows us to. In this case, because of the importance of the issue and the scope of the issue, I will allow questions if it's all right with everybody else.
And also,
Say yes
I
or
want
no.
to remind everyone that we're supposed to be in closed session to start the regular meeting at 5:30. So
Okay,
questions that you ask, we have to be able to log off to go into closed session.
all right. Any questions that has to be asked at this point? I'm not seeing anyone's hand up. Am I missing anyone?
I'm sorry,
Oh,
Chair.
yes, I'm
Wait.
sorry, Ms. Mishek. And Ms. Johnson, we'll go to Mishek first.
Excuse me, Chair. My understanding was you just said any questions that have to be asked right now. And so I'm wondering if this is a matter that will be discussed in closed session and it can wait, or if it's something that we'll be discussing as a board after closed session and my questions can wait. I'd appreciate some guidance from the board as to how everyone would like to proceed.
Well, closed session is for the board only. And so.
I'm sorry. I just mean in terms of my questions to the public speaker, is this a matter we will be discussing in closed session after this? And so I can ask my questions to Charles, for instance, or is this a question, or I guess I want to know if the board feels comfortable with my asking questions right now and if we have the time for it.
Well, clearly time is of the essence, but Mr. Oceanuga, what's your response to that?
Well, during closed session, I will only provide you with legal advice and information. So I'm imagining it's going to be separate and apart from what the public speaker has to offer. I hope that gives you some clarity.
Okay, well, if it's okay with the board, I'd like to ask a couple questions, and if it seems to become too extensive, please feel free to interrupt me. And so I'm curious from the, so my first question is that, you know, in public comment, the speaker, I don't want to butcher your last name. You mentioned that the way Richmond does it, that our fee schedule is not the rule of thumb in other cities. And so I'm wondering if you can provide some clarification on which cities you're referring to, which cities you've looked at that you're comparing Richmond to, and to what extent ours differs from other cities.
Sure. So other cities, for example, Daly City, Los Angeles, San Jose, none of those cities have this kind of a fee imposed on them. However, we did run into a situation in Daly City where they had a fee. They didn't call it the same fee, but it was similar. And what we ended up doing was we negotiated with them on what we call cost recovery. So whatever it actually cost them, we would pay them, and we would give them a small fee on top of that so that it wouldn't become a profit center. And when I say profit center, I mean that it's not fair that our project is subsidizing all of the other projects that are using your agency's services. But none of the cities in California that we've dealt with have ever imposed such a onerous fee that has a big impact on our permanent loan.
All right.
So just
I'm
for,
going to ask now that we go to the next speaker, because again, we're running up against a time problem. And that's a question that perhaps you'll also want to ask Mr. Oshanuga when we do get into closed session.
Okay.
Ms. Johnson, you had your hand up.
So I was just wondering, like, before you begin the renting of the apartments, the units, you're made aware of the various fees and the amounts of these fees from the beginning?
No, we were not aware of these fees at that time.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Shaw. Will you take it from this point, please?
Yes, thank you. I will go ahead. Hold on one second. I have to change
Just
the-
Chair Finley, just to mention for the sake of the speaker, there is a during our open session, our regular board meeting, there is public forum as well. So you would also have an opportunity to speak if you signed up for that as well. Additional 2 minutes. So it might be an opportunity for you all.
Thank you.
If you would like, I can go ahead and add him to the list while he's here.
Yeah,
Would you like to be added to the list of speakers when we open up the open session?
well, what time is that at?
Well, I can't say now because we're a little late for closed session. So,
Yeah, well, we didn't sign up. We didn't sign up for that, and we won't be able to make it. But I'm happy to have a meeting with your attorney or whoever would negotiate or deal with on this issue. I mean, we really don't like dealing with having our attorney be involved. We were really forced into this position, and I'd rather just negotiate in good faith. We're not trying to be unfair here. We want to be fair to you. We want you to be able to.
Excuse me. No, we're continuing. And I must say that the items that you have discussed this evening, I'm very glad to hear from you. But your attorney did a fine job in the letter, the 12-page letter that we received, going through the issues very carefully from your point of view. So again, I'm sorry you can't join us later, but at that point, your item is not on that agenda. So although you can speak to it, I think it's more important at this point that we get into closed session so that we can give some instruction to our attorneys about what we'd like to see from this point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Shaw.
yes. Okay. So now we're going to the next item. Now we're We're going to adjourn to closed session. The open session to hear public comment before closed session is adjourned at 5:22 p.m. So I'm going to instruct all board members to log onto the most updated link that was sent to you by email. If you have any questions, you can always text me. And so we'll go into a closed session.
Thank you. And Michelle, let the record show, if you can still hear me, that
Yes.
the closed session ended at 5:26 p.m.
I had 5:22, but you have
Go for it. Whichever
Okay.
you want to do. Just put a time on it.
Yes, that's why I said closed session adjourned at 5:22.
I didn't
Okay,
get the
thank
link
you.
Go
for
ahead, I'm
closed session.
sorry. Mhm.
I didn't get the link for closed session, sorry.
Yes, I sent it to you. I can go ahead. You want me to email it back to you again?
Yes, I don't see it.
Okay.
in- Thank
I
you.
just, I just sent an email about an hour ago. I sent a new one, so I'll send it to you right now. Board Member Johnson, I just sent it to you. So I sent it to both emails that I have on file for you. So just log off, either you can log off of this one. I don't know your technology, so you can log off of here and then log on to that link.
Okay, I still don't see it.
Okay, I just sent it to you. You want me to text it to you?
Oh, boy,
That'd
hold
be-
on.
I just emailed it to you.
Okay, hold on. That's not, texting is not gonna, oh
Okay.
my goodness, I don't see. Do you have the, it's Carol J 1999 at gmail.
Yes, I have it all. Yes, I did. I just forwarded it to you.
Okay, let me see again, because I don't see it. Hold on.
I sent it to both emails.
Yeah, only thing I see is the one
It's
that
gonna,
Nicholas.
it's gonna say updated closed session meeting link. That's what I just sent you. Let me go offline and call you and we can talk about that. But yeah, I sent it to you in your email.
I don't see it. Yeah.
Since I'll be right back, go run to the restroom.
All right. So Mr. Trailer just took a quick break. We're gonna wait until he come back, okay? Chair Finley, we wait until Nicholas just stepped away for a minute and we'll
All righty.
be right back.
By the way, should we take a quick break for everyone?
It's okay, it's fine with me. Is it okay, Charles?
You got to vote on that. Take a short recess.
Well, if we haven't opened the meeting, do we have to vote on it? Can't I just say that we want a 5-minute break?
We're not in closed session anymore, are we?
Well, we haven't opened it up for.
But we
reg-
haven't opened this.
Oh, okay, sure.
I'm giving us a 5-minute break.
Okay.
We will reconvene at 10 minutes to 7.
Okay, and then you'll call the meeting to order and then I'll take. the roll.
Exactly. Thank you.
Cindy, is this the correct slide you want, or do you want to update it?
Nicholas, you were away. So Chair Finley gave everyone a quick break before we reconvene. So I left this on until everyone is on.
Got it.
But she did say we'll reconvene at 5 minutes to 7.
Sounds good.
Yeah, before we start up again.
Be right back. I'm gonna fill up.
A few minutes.
Good evening. I am now calling the regularly scheduled meeting of the Richmond Rent Board to order at 6:51 p.m.
All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the November 17, 2021 regular meeting of the Richmond Rent Board. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance
To the flag
of the United
of the United
States
States
United
of
States
America
of America
to the
and
and
republic
to the
republic
republic
for
for which it
stands,
stands,
one nation,
one nation, under God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty and
with
justice
liberty
for
and
all.
justice for all.
The next item on the agenda is the roll call. For the purpose of the recording, may I please get an audible roll call from Rent Board members and staff? Board Member Connor,
Present.
Board Member Johnson,
Present.
Board Member Vasilas,
Here.
Vice Chair Mishek,
Present.
Chair Finley,
Present.
Executive Director Nicholas Traylor,
Present.
Deputy Director Fred Tran,
Present.
Staff Attorney Charles Oshanuga.
Here.
For the record, all board members and staff are present. The next item on the agenda is statement of conflict of interest. Are there any? Okay, hearing none. The next item on the agenda is report from legal counsel of final decisions made in closed session.
There were no final decisions made in closed session.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is agenda review. Are there any changes to the agenda?
Any changes on the agenda from staff?
No changes.
Any changes to the agenda from board members?
Okay, hearing none. The next item on the agenda is public forum. Tonight, we have one speaker. The speaker shall be allowed up to 2 minutes to address the board. When your name is called, please wait until the webinar host lets you know that you have been unmuted. For the record, please state your name and your residence is optional. Please terminate your address to the board when your time expires. We ask that you keep your comments respectful and appropriate. You will be muted when your time expires. And the speaker is Mr. Cordell Hindler. Let me let you in. Cordell?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
So, good evening, hold on.
Yeah, you're
So,
having.
good evening, Chair Finley. Yes, so good evening, Chair Finley, commissioners. My name is Cordell Handler and I'm a Richmond resident. So I do have an invitation for you all. So first, I do apologize for missing the last meeting. Last month, it was a scheduling conflict. So that's one. Then you're cordially invited to attend a performance of Home for the Holidays at Contra Costa Civic Theater on December the 3rd through the 5th at 7:30 p.m. Tickets are $40 for adults, but if you get the youth rate, it's $20. Proof of vaccination is required, and you have to wear a mask inside. One, and then number two is on the consent calendar G5. I think that it's time that we ought to go back to do it like a hybrid model, because I was in a meeting last night for the Pinot City Council, and it was on their agenda regarding if we want to continue the meeting virtually. So I'm thinking like, a hybrid model would be suitable, because I feel that as a resident, I want to see faces. Because we've been in a virtual warp for about a year and a half. So I'm thinking that once things, calms down, we'll be able to meet in person again. So that way I can see staff and the board again. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
That's it.
All right. That was the only speaker. The next item on the agenda is to approve the consent calendar.
Is there a motion? Do we have a motion and a second to accept the consent calendar? Or does anybody have any issues that they'd like to take off the calendar?
I move to accept the consent calendar barring any issues anyone wants to deal with.
Thank you, Ms. Mishik. Next, anyone to second that?
I'll second.
Thank you,
Board
Ms.
Member
Johnson.
Okay. All right, we'll take a vote. Board Member Connor,
Yes.
Board Member Johnson,
Yes.
Board Member Vasilas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Mishek. Vice
Yeah.
Chair,
Sorry, yes.
okay. Chair Finley.
Yes.
Motion passes to approve the consent calendar unanimously. Now we're moving on to item H under regulations. Item H1 is to adopt proposed rent board regulation 425 titled waiver of delinquent residential housing fee assessment. There are no speakers on this item. Fred, are you allowed to pull up the PowerPoints?
Actually, I'll be,
Oh. You're
so
gonna do it?
I have
Okay.
it already. I'm just going to share my screen.
I'll make you the host now.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Hopefully you see the presentation.
Yes.
Here we go.
Great. All right. Chair Finley and members of the Rent Board, Nicholas Traylor, Executive Director. I'll be presenting on the proposed Rent Board Regulation 425, which deals with policy around waiving of delinquent residential housing fees. Late fees. And of course, after the presentation, I'm happy to answer any questions. I just there we go. All right, in terms of statement of the issue, At the September 15th, 2021 regular meeting of the Rent Board, Rent Program staff presented an overview of the existing internal late fee policy, seeking feedback from the board regarding the creation of a board-approved late fee waiver regulation. Regulation 425 is aimed at clarifying and simplifying the current late fee waiver process while simultaneously ensuring proper levels of rent board transparency and oversight. In terms of fiscal impact, there may be an impact related to staff time in addition in adding this additional layered process to the waiver of the late fees. Additionally, as late fee payments are reported in the rent board's overall revenue, waiver of any assessed late fees would necessarily have an impact on overall revenue. So let's start by discussing the importance of the autonomy of the rent board in terms of this regulation. Section 11.100.060M of the rent ordinance establishes both the integrity and autonomy of the rent board by mandating that the rent board, quote, be an integral part of the government of the city of Richmond and exercise its powers under the chapter independent from the city council, city manager, and city attorney, except by request of the rent board. The rent ordinance further vests the rent board with the sole power to oversee and adopt its own budget, while establishing that the city council and the city manager shall have no authority to oversee, supervise, or approve this budget. The rent program budget, as we've mentioned many times in the past, is comprised only of reasonable and necessary expenses to achieve the purpose of the rent ordinance, and is currently funded in whole by the rental housing fee charged all landlords in an amount deemed necessary and reasonable by the rent board and approved by the city council. Since its inception, since we started the rent program, the rent program has waived $142,644 and some change. This number actually is the old number that we reported on at the last meeting. So it has been adjusted a little bit over the last couple months. However, what's important to note is that $25,682 in late fees were waived prior to the pandemic. And once the pandemic hit, $116,962 in late fees were waived. Because the rent board has the full authority over the rent program budget and spending, in other words, the fees collected and or waived, and in the interest of public transparency, staff recommend that all late fee waivers, waiver approvals and or denials be subject to rent board approval. It's important. I think this slide is going to demonstrate or discuss the internal policy that was established with regard to waiver of late fees. Since 2017, the rent program has sent out rental housing fee invoices to all Richmond landlords on an annual basis. And in its efforts, as we have been collecting those fees, staff members have encountered some of the following issues concerning landlords' non-payment of the fees. One of the issues is that the rent program regularly discovers rental units that have not been enrolled since the inception of the program, or that have changed status from non-rented to rented over the years without informing the rent program. Some landlords claim to not have received an invoice in the first place because maybe there was a billing or a mailing or clerical error. In those cases, late fees were either waived in full or in part. Finally, some owners assert a financial hardship, health issues, or other reasonable bases for not paying the rental housing fee on time. And there have been only a few circumstances where landlords were late for more than one fiscal year and requested a late fee waiver, multiple times. Given these various circumstances surrounding the non-payment of the fees, the rent program adopted an internal policy regarding the assessment of late fees. Under their current internal policy, the executive director or his or her designee may waive all or some of the late fees based on the criteria described above and listed in the late fee request for late fee waiver form, which is attached to the compiled agenda report. Currently, the current waiver, this internal policy, lacks rent board approval and or oversight. And to ensure the appropriate level of rent board oversight and public accountability, staff members are seeking direction and feedback from the rent board with regard to the drafting of a proposed rent board late fee waiver regulation that would achieve the proper degree of oversight and accountability. After receiving direction from the rent board at the September 15th regular meeting of the rent board, we have drafted a proposed regulation that not only sets forth the rent board approved criteria for granting a waiver, but also standards for when fees should be approved in full or in part. So just a quick overview of the proposed regulation 425. 425 formalizes the rent program's internal policy and practices related to late fees and establishes a rent board presence that is needed to provide oversight and transparency. It would keep in place the official rent program form needed to request a late fee waiver, while at the same time limit the executive director's discretion to waive late fees. And I just will say that, of course, based on the feedback we receive from the board, the rent board form can be modified, if need be. Regulation 425 creates a requirement that the executive director find what's known as good cause prior to waiving any fees, and any finding of good cause must consider a set of factors as described in the regulation. And then finally, the regulation requires that the executive director provide the rent board with a written recommendation, a summary spreadsheet that describes the date of the request, the reason for the request, a recommendation to approve or deny the request, and the total amount waived. There is some discretion allowed in this internal policy for executive director discretion. Under Regulation 425, any landlord requesting the waiver of late fees must make said requests on the official rent program form. The form is the same form that we've used in prior fiscal years when the executive director was considering landlord requests for waiver of late fees. We believe that the form has been shown to be a simple and effective in terms of evaluating a landlord's request for a late fee waiver. As it relates to executive director discretion, Regulation 425 limits it in two ways. First, it transfers the final approval or denial of late fee waiver requests from most late fee waiver requests from the executive director to the rent board. And it requires that where a landlord demonstrates a rent program billing error, their assessed late fees will be waived in its entirety. And this would be done ministerially. In other words, it would obviously limit the executive director's discretion, but it would allow for some ministerial waiver of the late fees. And just overall, it will help provide transparency in the late fee waiver process while still providing rent board oversight. So let's talk a little bit about the good cause standard. Regulation 425 would require a showing of good cause prior to the waiving of any late fees. Good cause is defined as taking of reasonable efforts while acting with due diligence to remit timely payment of the residential rental housing fee. In other words, it's an evaluation of whether the landlord took reasonable efforts and acted with due diligence in their attempt to pay the residential rental housing fee. Regulation 425 would also guide this inquiry by requiring the executive director to evaluate applicable enumerated factors prior to making a determination of whether there exists good cause to grant the request. And finally, the regulation would establish that a rent program billing error would always constitute good cause to waive the late fee assessment. In terms of the process and procedure, 425, Regulation 425 would create a process and procedure consistent with the one that's outlined in the prior to presentations on this item. And the proposed process includes the following. The rent program staff receives a request for a late fee waiver from the landlord. The executive director or his or her designee reviews the late fee waiver request and issues a recommendation to the rent board to approve the waiver in full or in part, or deny the waiver based on the landlord's reason for requesting the waiver and their payment history. Rent program staff would then compile the late fee waiver requests for each month and place that list on the consent calendar for the following rent board meeting. Rent board members would then review a spreadsheet with details on each request. So there would be the day of the request, the reasons for the request, and a recommendation to the board to approve or deny the request and total amount waived. So late fee waiver requests, each late fee waiver request form would be included as an attachment for the board's review, with the caveat, of course, that there would be whatever necessary redactions of private information. Rent board members would vote to approve recommended waivers or may pull individual requests from the consent calendar for further discussion. We believe that the majority of the late fee waiver requests will be solely the subject of the consent calendar. And where there is a dispute regarding the executive director's written recommendation, the rent board can pull the item for further discussion. Additionally, where the requester has received 2 separate late fee waiver grants in the prior 3 fiscal years, the request cannot go to the consent calendar, but rather it would be agendized as a rent board as a whole agenda item. Now, let's talk a little bit about the late fee waiver amounts under this regulation. Regulation 425 clarifies that the rent board may waive the late fees in any amount except where certain factors are present. Where the late fee assessment was due to a billing error, 100% of the late fees must be waived. Likewise, where the landlord has made timely payments in the 2 prior fiscal years, all of their late fee assessments must be waived. Conversely, where the board or the rent program has granted late fee waiver requests in the prior 3 fiscal years, the board's discretion of waived amounts is limited to a tiered scale as described in Rent Board Regulation 425G. And we'll get to that in a second. Here it is. Regulation 425 Section D lays out the amounts and the standards. So in the event that the late fee waiver request is granted, the late fee shall be waived in a discretionary amount that is subject to the following. rent program billing errors result in 100% of the assessed late fees being waived. Timely payments in the 2 prior fiscal years should result in 100% of the assessed late fees being waived. 1 late fee waiver request granted in the prior 3 fiscal years, the late fee assessment shall be reduced to at least a 10% assessment, as described in the Richmond City Council Ordinance number 16-17 NS. In other words, they're the city's late fee waiver schedule. 2 late fee waiver requests granted in the prior 3 fiscal years, the late fee assessment shall be reduced to at least a 25% assessment as described in the late fee waiver schedule that the city council has adopted. 3 late fee waiver requests granted in the prior 3 fiscal years, the late fee assessment shall not be reduced. For purposes of this section, a grant or a grant of a late fee waiver request based on a rent program billing error shall not count towards a quote late fee waiver request grant as described in regulation 425G, L or G1, G2, and G3. So the recommended action for the board tonight is, upon direction provided by the rent board, adopt proposed regulation 425 titled Waiver of Delinquent Residential Housing Fee Assessment. And the regulation itself is part of the compiled agenda. And of course, we welcome any feedback or suggestions related to the proposed regulation or questions. And that is it.
Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Traylor.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Traylor from members of the board? I don't see any hands. Am I missing anybody?
Chair Finley, if I can for a second.
Of course.
Thank you. I just want to point out there is a clerical error. It's in the regulation section G, the last paragraph that says, for purposes of this section, a grant of a late fee waiver request based on a rent program billing error should not count towards a late fee waiver request grant as described in regulation G1, G2, and G3. Nick, if you can go down to slide 14, I think that's where the language is. All right, yeah, so that last paragraph, it should read G2, G3, G4, and G5. So if you adopt the regulation as is, let's just make sure you adopt it with those changes, because that's a clerical change. I won't need to go back and change when you come back. It's a misnumbering issue.
I'm sorry, I got lost here.
I'm sorry. All right, so starting with slide 14. So slide 14 is a copy and paste from the actual regulation, right? And the clerical error that's occurring is at the last paragraph. When you look at slide 14, that last paragraph that starts with "for purposes of this section."
Got it.
Okay, so as it reads, it essentially says that if you have a late fee waiver request granted based on a billing error, it doesn't count towards an overall grant that you would assess in section G3, G4, and G5. It just needs to be changed. That numbering, I say as described in regulation 425 G1, G2, and G3, it needs to be changed to say G3, G4, and G5. It's a misnumbering error.
G2, G3, and did you say G5?
G3, G4, and G5.
Okay, I've got it.
Okay, just at the very last bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Oshanuga. Again, any questions? All right. Since we don't seem to have any more questions from the members of the board, do we have any speakers from the audience?
No speakers on this item.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further discussion about this item? Would anyone like to proffer a motion and a second?
So
I've
I'll move
moved-
that we accept the regulations.
All right.
Councilwoman Johnson,
Yes.
May I make a quick amendment to that? You are accepting the motion that we're adopting. I'm sorry, I just got lost here in my paperwork.
I think what Chair
I'm sorry.
Finley is going to say is to amend your proposal to reflect the correction that Mr. Oceanuga just shared. So,
And that the rent board is Regulation 425 titled Waiver of Delinquent Residential Housing Fee Assessment. And then, as Ms. Connor said, to then cite the changes to G 3, 4, and 5. Is that acceptable to you?
Yes.
Thank you. May we have a second?
I'll second Board Member Connor.
Thank you, Board Member Connor. May we have a vote?
yes. Board Member Connor,
Yes,
Board Member Johnson,
Yes.
Board Member Vasilas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Mishek,
Yes.
and Chair Finley.
Yes.
Motion passes to adopt item H1 unanimous. The next item on the agenda is item I1 under Rent Board as a whole. Item I1 is to receive and approve the fiscal years 2019 through 2020 and 2020 through 2021 rent program annual report and direct staff to present the report to the City Council. There is one speaker on this item.
Call the first speaker, please.
You want to call the speaker first? Or do you want to hear the staff report?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead with the staff report. My apology.
No problem.
Thank you, Chair Finley and members of the Rent Board. Again, Nicholas Traylor here, Executive Director of the Rent Program. I'm here to present the fiscal years 2019-20 and fiscal year 2020-21 annual report. Section 11.100.060 of the Fair Rent, Just Cause for Eviction and Homeowner Protection Ordinance requires that the Rent Board, through its administrative arm, the Rent Program, report annually to the City Council of the City of Richmond on the status of rental housing in Richmond. Prior to presenting to the City Council, the Rent Program presents to the Rent Board. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it's had on the agency's focus and resources, we've combined both fiscal year 2019-20 and fiscal year 2020-21. In this presentation, I'll be explaining the purpose or mission of the rent ordinance. After that, I'll examine how the rent program works to effectuate the purpose of the rent ordinance through active enforcement. And then we will examine the rent program's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We will look at rent increase and notices of termination of tenancy data and rent program finances for both fiscal year 2019-20 and fiscal year 2020-21. But first, I would like to take the moment here to acknowledge rent program staff, former rent program staff, and board members for their contributions in helping the rent program become one of the most effective public agencies in the city of Richmond. In 2019-20 and in 2020-21, the rent program worked tirelessly to serve the Richmond community, Richmond tenants and landlords during what has been an unprecedented time of societal and, of course, community instability. I would also like to acknowledge some former staff and of course, the current board members for their service to the community and for providing the rent program with policy direction that we need in order to enforce the ordinance. Thus, in terms of former board members, I'd like to acknowledge our former chair, David Gray, our former rent board member, Nancy Combs, former chair, Lauren Maddock, former vice chair, Emma Gerald, and board member, Kamiola Duncan. Current rent board members include the chair of the rent board, Virginia Finley, the vice chair of the rent board, Shiva Mishek, board member, Michael Vasilas, and board member, Carol Jones. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list of all the folks that have contributed to the rent board and the rent program. But this is a high level overview, and I can't go into the weeds with regard to that. I think it is important to note that over the last 4 years, the rent board members have adopted 148, well now 149 regulations and 4 resolutions. They have established a financial reserve policy, have successfully adopted 4 annual rent program budgets and contracts with legal service providers such as the Eviction Defense Center and Barrier Legal Aid. So we really appreciate the service of the current and past board members. And of course, we also need to thank some of our former staff, including our Deputy Director, Paige Russa, who was instrumental in helping make the program what it is today. We also have a slew of former staff such as Magali Chavez, Philip Verma, Vicky Medina, Sarah Schaff, Erica Foster, Joanna Gurian, Madeline Rivas, Ravinder Gupta, Han Cheng, and Gabi Ariola. Let's begin with discussing the purpose, Let's begin with discussing the purpose and mission of the rent program. The mission of the rent program is to promote neighborhood and community stability, healthy housing, and affordability for Richmond tenants through the regulating for the regulating of those landlord-tenant matters that reasonably relate to rents and evictions while maintaining a landlord's right to a fair return. A large part of this annual report focuses on the connection between health and housing. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the intrinsic connection between housing stability, community stability, and health. What I'm going to be asserting tonight about the connection between health and housing is really based on a lot of academic studies and research that has been done that have been, we have cited them in our annual report. Now, since the spring of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on the financial, physical, and mental well-being of everyone around the world. Millions of renters have struggled and continue to struggle to pay rent due to a loss of income caused by the pandemic. increased out-of-pocket expenses, lost childcare, among a multitude of other reasons related to the pandemic. So in an effort to slow the spread of the COVID-19 virus and therefore save lives, governments at all levels have instituted policies to stabilize housing and stem displacement. Now, the Richmond Rent Ordinance provides Richmond tenants with housing stability that's similar to the type of housing stability enjoyed by homeowners who have fixed-term mortgages. The housing stability provided by the rent ordinance allows tenants to plan for the future because they know what their rent increases will be and because they know that they'll be limited. And also because they know that they're protected from unwarranted or arbitrary evictions. The housing stability provided by the rent ordinance also contributes significantly to financial stability and economic mobility. This financial stability allows Richmond tenants to invest in their futures, to save money for college, retirement, their physical and mental health, and to spend their time and money giving back to the community and local economy. And of course, housing stability has a significant impact on health outcomes. Forced moves, including those due to rent increases, evictions, and uninhabitable conditions, are associated with depression, anxiety, parental stress, as well as nutritional deficiencies. For seniors and people with disabilities or chronic illnesses, an eviction can really even be fatal. Now, the inverse is also true. Greater stability is linked to better long-term mental and physical health outcomes. For example, our rent ordinance reduces the likelihood of forced moves and protects tenants who assert their right to decent habitable housing from unwarranted evictions. It also contributes to academic performance because kids are less likely to have to switch school districts or to be disrupted, mid-year as the family is being evicted due to notice of termination of tenancy or rent increase. Neighborhood stability, housing stability really has a macro effect in terms of the society because it has been shown through various studies to improve both social cohesion and mental health outcomes. And from this little chart, you can see this connection here very clearly. And housing stability contributes to the following benefits: financial stability, academic performance, which all of these things lead to better health outcomes. Now, when you have better health outcomes, what does that do? That further reinforces your financial stability, your academic performance, your likelihood, the likelihood that the person's going to be displaced and become homeless. And I can't tell you the impact of housing instability on mental health, because our housing counselors, including myself, have spoken to hundreds of tenants who work very hard, don't make a lot of money, and upon receiving an eviction notice or having to defend against an eviction attempt, just really struggled extremely with their mental health. And it's often difficult for us as staff to have to absorb it. So one of the things that's somewhat unique about the Richmond Rent Program is that we actively enforce the rent ordinance. Active enforcement has three components. The first is property enrollment and tenancy registration. Second is counseling, mediation, and community education. And the third is the rent adjustment petition process. These three components work together to help landlords and tenants not only understand their rights and responsibilities so that they're more likely to comply with the law, but they really help both the landlord and the tenant understand what the maximum allowable rent is, and how to enforce their rights through the rent adjustment petition process. So a complete and accurate count of rental units in Richmond really benefits tenants and landlords. The rent program, for example, can better reach and educate tenants and landlords who are enrolled and whose tenancies are registered. Tenants and landlords benefit from the information the rent program records and provides regarding the maximum allowable rent, because it makes transparent the lawful rent that can be charged. That significantly improves compliance with the rent ordinance. The rent program has devoted significant resources to building an accurate database of rental units in Richmond. And of course, this was done by collecting property enrollment forms from each landlord in Richmond. And this information supports an efficient billing cycle. It equips the rent program with the information needed to accurately calculate the rental housing fee as well. The information submitted by landlords in the tenancy registration forms helps make transparent to both landlords and tenants the amount of rent that may be charged. We call that the maximum allowable rent. And we use that information to calculate the MAR for each rent controlled unit, and then notify landlords and tenants and inform them of the lawful rent. Of course, there have been studies also that have shown that when tenants and landlords are on the same page about the rent that can be charged, disputes over the maximum, or disputes over the rent are less likely to occur. Furthermore, studies also found that the tracking of the maximum allowable rent significantly contributes to compliance with rent control laws. Now in fiscal year 2019-20 and fiscal year 2021, the rent program mailed out 1,111 property enrollment packets. We enrolled 673 properties and had 2,494 consultations with billing and registration staff. So the rent program is open Monday through Friday to help tenants and landlords understand their rights and responsibilities under the rent ordinance. Our housing counselors provide holistic counseling to assist community members with a wide range of issues pertaining to the rent ordinance. Counselors provide community members with really individualized, customized assistance, and we connect them also to important outside resources. We hold community workshops, and we have been doing it for many years. For a long time, it was one Saturday each month. Since the pandemic, instead of holding in-person workshops, they've all been webinars, virtual webinars. The rent program also offers mediation services to both tenants and landlords who are dealing with conflicts. This is really an alternative to submitting a rent adjustment petition because the mediation process allows landlords and tenants to resolve their issues in a neutrally comfortable setting with the assistance of a trained mediator. We also provide access to legal services, which are key to navigating the justice system and leveling the playing field for tenants who generally cannot afford to hire a private attorney to defend against evictions. The rent program partners with both the Eviction Defense Center and Barrier Legal Aid to connect community members with legal services they need to enforce their rights under the rent ordinance. So in fiscal year 2019-20 and fiscal year 2021, there was a total of 9,670 counseling sessions conducted. In fiscal year 1920 and 2021, we had 574 community workshop participants. We had 218 households that were referred to legal service providers, so lawyers, and that was for both fiscal years as well. And also for both fiscal years, we held 20 mediations between tenants and landlords. So the rent ordinance provides a recourse really to compel healthy housing and healthy habitable housing. And it also provides an incentive to invest in maintaining rental properties. This is achieved through the rent adjustment petition process. So landlords who invest in maintaining or improving their properties can elect to file a fair return petition to increase the rent beyond the annual cost of living increase. And tenants, on the other hand, who are living in substandard conditions or who experience a decrease in habitability or usable space or housing services can file a petition to decrease the rent until repairs are made or services restored. And a rent reduction petition is really an effective means to compel timely repairs. With regard to our activity related to the rent adjustment petition process, we have to look to the hearings unit. And in the hearings unit for the combined fiscal year period, there were 937 consultations with the hearings unit coordinator, also known as Cynthia Shaw. For both fiscal years, our hearing examiner reached 41 settlement agreements between landlords and tenants. The hearing examiner also ordered 13 individual rent decreases during both fiscal years combined, and 7 individual rent increases for landlords. Those were fair return petitions were filed during those 2 fiscal years. So, this has been a strange time for everyone. A lot of effort has been expended by the rent program, serving tenants who have been struggling to pay rent. And we have expended as much effort assisting landlords who are facing financial hardship due to tenants not paying the rent. So to provide some relief for those landlords who are struggling financially, the rent program adopted a policy for landlords who are struggling that allowed them to request a deferral of the rental housing fee or request for a payment plan. And during the pandemic, $116,000, almost $117,000 in late fees were waived in situations that are listed in the late fee waiver form, many of which were for landlords facing financial hardship because the tenants were not paying rent. The rent program also worked to assist tenants who were struggling to pay the rent. And we did this by spearheading the development of the first rent assistance program dedicated solely to Richmond landlords and tenants. Just a little bit of background, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the rent program met with city officials and began having discussions about the potential of creating a rent assistance program for Richmond residents. Those discussions eventually led to the creation of Richmond's rent assistance program, which to date has dispersed over $150,000 to Richmond landlords and tenants through their Richmond Rapid Response Fund. The rent program has also been a hub of information for Richmond landlords and tenants with regard to pandemic-related laws and rent assistance. So for example, we put together 20 online educational webinars. We put together a comprehensive fact sheet on the state and local laws. I don't know how many pages it is now, but it's an extensive document, at least I think close to 20 pages or more. We also continue to provide housing counseling. We did so, of course, at the beginning of the pandemic only remotely, but as of June 21st of 2021, we began doing in-person counseling sessions and Zoom counseling sessions by appointment only. Speaking of appointments, we actually developed an online appointment system that made it much easier to secure a counseling appointment with rent program staff. And I'm just going to say one of the things that pleased me the most was when I saw the Berkeley Rent Stabilization Program copy or concept about a month or two after we did it. So I was like, ah. We also have put together instructional webinars, 2 instructional webinars on how to apply for rent assistance through the California Rent Relief Program. We also created the Rent Assistance Resource webpage. We send out a postcard to all Richmond residents, informing them of rent assistance resources and the eviction moratoria. And just a little bit of a background to that, we have actually been tracking how many people called us as a result of these postcards, and it was about 12 to 13% of our calls came directly from those postcards. And so we thought that was effective. Now, the other thing is that, every time a termination of tenancy notice is filed with the rent program, which is required by the rent ordinance and our regulations, we've sent out courtesy compliance letters to both the landlord and the tenants regarding the eviction moratoria. So we sent out over 800 courtesy compliance letters during this 2-year period. And those compliance letters, for example, would be, if a landlord submitted a rent increase notice, but there was a countywide moratorium on rent increases. And so we'd send them a notice saying, hey, by the way, there's a countywide moratorium. If the owner submitted a notice of termination of tenancy, we would send out a notice basically saying, you should know your rights under the Tenant Protection Act of 2020, and here they are, and here's what your obligations are. So we feel that has been a very effective means of contacting the folks who most needed it. I debated for a while as to whether or not to talk about this in the annual report, but I thought it was such importance that I'm going to do it. And I'm going to pretty much just read off of this because I'm not very good at it's very detailed. So just a little bit of background. There is this ongoing false narrative that goes around. It's been on social media. Certain politicians have also mentioned it, that the rent ordinance has led to a loss of rental units. And they pointed to the initial fee study that estimated there being about 25,000 units. And then as over time, by May of 2020, the actual number of rental units that we had in our database was more like $17,684. So during that time period, it almost appeared as if there had been a loss of 7,000 rental units. And so did it mean that Richmond actually lost 7,113 rental units between 2017 and 2020? And the short answer is no. Richmond did not lose 7,000 rental units between 2017 and 2020. Instead, between those years, staff members investigated and refined the database of suspected rental units in order to identify only those that are truly rented. Now, the fiscal year 2016-17 and fiscal year 2017-18 fee studies utilized data that was provided by the county, the Contra Costa County Assessor's Office, to identify suspected rental units. While this data was used to arrive at an estimated number of rental units, it doesn't actually produce or couldn't produce an exact figure. Nevertheless, that was the best data that was available to us at the time. Now, one assumption used to identify suspected rental units included that all housing units in the city of Richmond where there was no homeowners tax exemption on file were possibly rentals, were likely rentals. This assumption substantially overestimated the overall number of rental units in Richmond. Now, we found out from various community members, mainly landlords, that there are a number of reasons why an owner might not have claimed a homeowner's tax exemption. And just to clarify, a tax exemption is a reduction in your taxes if you own or occupy your property. There were several reasons why that some owners had not done that. A surprising number of landlords actually didn't even know about the homeowner's tax exemption. The owner didn't qualify for the homeowner's tax exemption because they don't live in the property as their primary residence. In other words, they used the property for other purposes other than renting it out. So I think that's important for the board to understand. So what was the reason for this discrepancy? And how did the estimate of close to 25,000 rental units in 2017 decrease to less than 18,000 in 2020? So the county assessor data that was used really creates a very rough estimate of suspected rental units. We worked very closely with the city's IT department to construct the program and the city's first comprehensive database of rental units. Using the county assessor data, cross-checking that against the city's rental inspection program, showed many units as homeowner exempt. And at that time, approximately 23,500 units were estimated to have been recorded. Later in 2017, we mailed out invoices to these owners of suspected rental units, 23,500 suspected rental units. In response, we received 4,087 suspected rental units, approximately 4,087 suspected rental units were determined to be exempt based on feedback from owners. And they explained that their units were either owner occupied or used from some other purpose. And this left approximately 19,413 suspected rental units. And between 2018 and 2020, owners of more than 1,500 units in the rent program's database of suspected rental units contacted the rent program upon receipt of having received the rental housing fee to claim that their units were inapplicable to the rent ordinance. Reasons included it was owner occupied, or it was rent-free. The properties were not offered for rent or used from some other purpose, or otherwise weren't applicable due to their location outside of city boundaries, or maybe it was a vacant lot that was initially added to the initial database. Now, as of May 2020, not that long ago, the latest estimate of rental units in the city totaled 17,684. As of June of this year, we found approximately 3,200 new rental units. And we added those to the rent program database, bringing the total number of rental units to approximately 20,910. And it's important for the board and the public to know that the number here, whether it's 20,910 or some other number, will continue to fluctuate, especially in Richmond, because we have a high number of single-family homes and condominiums that are rented, that are of course bought and sold and rented by one owner or owner occupied by another. So it's important that the public know, everyone knows, that our efforts to refine our database have been fruitful. And as you can see, it was a process, and it wasn't about these rental units being taken off the market or completely lost. It was actually just finding out what they were and finding them. So I wanted to mention that's a very important part of the annual report, because it has been probably the most damaging accusation that has been thrown at the rent board and rent program. And it's easily, that kind of misinformation is easily spread on social media and by politicians. And it's, of course, not appropriate. So the question is, how many rental units have actually been lost? Well, our records show that between the rent program's establishment in 2017 and the end of this fiscal year, this last fiscal year, 2020, 2021, 190 units were withdrawn from the rental market pursuant to Ellis Act. 51 units were removed from the rental market due to owner move-ins, and that totals 241 units removed from Richmond's rental housing stock. So let's talk a little bit about where we're at today. At this moment, compared, we actually gained 1,481 new fully controlled rental units, so multi-unit properties that were previously not enrolled or registered with the rent program. So we're now at close to 9,000, 8,996 in terms of fully covered units. We also saw an increase of 1,706 rental units in fiscal year 2021, 22, of partially covered units. These are units that are only covered by just cause, and they include I was about to point to it like you could see me, but this number, 11,914, includes the 4,337 governmentally subsidized units, and those include Section 8 vouchers, LIHTC units, and project-based subsidized units. Now, this slide, I think really, I put this slide in here, and I put this in the annual report because I think it's important, again, for the public to know what the rent program is and how we fit in the city. So the rent program is an agency that is independent from the city of Richmond. I previously mentioned about that in the late fee waiver presentation, but it's important to know that the rent board and the rent program function as integral parts of the city of Richmond, but they exercise their powers and duties independent from the city council, city manager, and city attorney, except by request of the rent board. So in other words, for example, the rent board adopts its own annual budget, hires an executive director who reports to the 5-member rent board and not the city manager. Another important fact is that the funding for the rent program is independent from and not tied to the general fund. That is also something that is misunderstood about the rent program. There's often this misunderstanding that somehow the funding of the rent program is tied to the general fund, which it is not. The rent ordinance also provides homeowners extra protections. So the rent ordinance carves out protections for single-family homeowners who rent out rooms in their house or rent out permitted ADU units. So, for example, if a homeowner shares a kitchen and or bath with a tenant, they are not subject to rent control or the requirement to have just cause. And this protection was put in place as an incentive for single-family homeowners to construct newly permitted rental units and to encourage the legalization of many of the unpermitted backyard and in-law dwelling units. And of course, the rental housing fee is adopted by the city, the rental housing fee is passed or adopted by the city council and paid by landlords to finance the program's reasonable and necessary expenses. Landlords also have a constitutionally protected right to a fair return, and that's through the maintenance of net operating income petition. The MNOI petition evaluates a landlord's assertion that they are not receiving a fair return, and if so demonstrated, grants a landlord a rent increase in an amount determined necessary to provide a landlord a fair return. And it's important to note that the courts have consistently upheld the constitutionality of the maintenance of net operating income process. Now, I also want the public and of course board members to know that landlords who are not in compliance with the rent ordinance may be prohibited from raising rents, and that's for rent controlled units only, or terminating tenancies, and that's for the vast majority of all rental units. Now, tenants may use a landlord's non-compliance with the rent ordinance as a defense to an eviction lawsuit. To be in compliance, landlords must enroll their rental properties with the rent program, pay the rental housing fee, and follow the eviction and rent increase noticing requirements. Landlords of rent-controlled properties may be prohibited from raising the rent if they are not in compliance with the rent ordinance. And there are special noticing requirements for landlords. And one of the key ways that the rent program monitors rents and evictions and enforces the rent ordinance is through special noticing requirements. So landlords of controlled rental units must submit to the rent program copies of rent increase notices served on the tenant within 10 business days after having served the tenant. Landlords of rental units that are covered by the requirement to have just cause to evict must submit copies of any notice of termination of tenancy to the rent program within 2 business days of having served the tenant. Rent increases that are above the maximum allowable rent and termination of tenancy notices that are not in compliance with the requirements to have just cause to evict result in the landlord and tenant receiving a special mailing, we've called the courtesy compliance letter in most cases, providing information to them of their rights and responsibilities under applicable local and state law. And it's also important to note that failure on the part of the landlord to adhere to the noticing requirements can be used by a tenant as a defense to an eviction lawsuit. So let's just take a quick look at Richmond's affordable housing profile. So affordable housing accounts for over 20% of the rental housing stock in Richmond. There are an estimated there's an estimated 4,337 affordable housing units in Richmond. That includes LIHTC units and vouchers on the private market. This map shows locations of developments, and you can see a lot of them are concentrated in the southern and western parts of the city. There are also some around Hilltop. There are several subsidy types. There's units built or rehabbed with low-income housing tax credits. There are 2,925 of those. Low-income tenants receive below market rent, but that's not necessarily tied to their income. It's not tied to their income. It's based on area median income in terms of establishing what their starting rent is and the rent increases going forward. And partially for this reason, the Rent Board adopted Resolution 19-01 that limits rent increases in certain LIHTC units to 5% annually. There are 789 units that have project-based rental assistance. These are also known as project-based Section 8. These are direct contracts with HUD, and the rent is capped as a percentage of the household income. And there are currently 1,215 units with housing choice vouchers, or also known as Section 8 vouchers. And those vouchers are currently being administered by the Contra Costa County Housing Authority. And again, the rent is capped at a percentage of the household income. And there are some overlap between subsidy types. So for example, about half of the LIHTC units also receive housing choice vouchers. So some tenants that live in LIHTC units have a Section 8 voucher. So although the Rent Board authorized the annual general adjustments for both 2019 and 2020, and they were 3.5% in 2019 and 2.9% in 2020, there were between March of 2020 and September of 2020, pursuant to the City of Richmond's emergency owners of properties with more than one dwelling unit built before February 1st, 1995, including LIHTC properties, cannot increase the rent on residential rental units. Thereafter, between October 2020 and September 2021, landlords of rent-controlled properties were prohibited from increasing rents pursuant to the Contra Costa County Urgency Ordinance. These moratoriums on rent increases significantly reduced the number of rent increase notices filed with the rent program. Although it's not part of this report, the annual general adjustment for 2021 is 1.6%, and landlords are able to take the 2020 AGA at 2.9% and the 2021 AGA of 1.6%, effective October 1st of this year, and assuming that they're in compliance with the rent ordinance.
Nick, if I could stop.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Cindy. I'm sorry.
I was just going to interrupt. We're actually past the 3-hour mark. And so we would need to take a vote to extend the meeting.
Almost done too.
Okay, so Chair Finley, we need to take a vote to extend the meeting. We're past the 3-hour mark.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Yes, I'll entertain a motion to continue the meeting for what? Will 20 minutes do it, Mr. Trailer?
Yeah, yes.
Half an hour?
No more than a half an hour. but
Okay,
maybe 20 minutes.
Okay.
all right.
so-
May I have a motion, please?
I'll
Have a
make a
second?
motion to extend the meeting for 20 minutes or half an hour. What did we say?
Let's make it a half an hour. That
Half
way
an
we're
hour.
sure to be out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the change to that. May I have a second, please?
Oh, we already did the second, so we're doing a vote.
All right, thank you.
Who was the second?
Uh,
Board Member Fasilas,
then who was the first?
Chair Finley,
I'm sorry. I thought that the first was Mr. Vasilis.
I made the motion, yeah.
oh,
All right.
I thought you said I'll make the motion. Okay, I'm sorry. So, Board Member Vasilas is first and who's the second?
And then who was the second?
We didn't have a second then. I thought you were the first and he was the second. So we need a second if
Board Member Bryce Connor will be the second.
okay.
Thank you. May we have a vote, please?
Board Member Connor,
Yes.
Board Member Johnson,
Yes.
Board Member Vancilas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Mishek, Vice Chair Mishek,
Yes.
and Chair Finley.
With a great deal of energy and to get this thing done, yes.
So we're extending the meeting time so that was at 8:07, so it'll be 8:37. You said 30 extra minutes, right? Half an hour? So-
8:37 is just fine.
Okay, so we extended the meeting. A motion passes to extend the meeting to 8:37 PM. Okay, you may continue.
Mr. Trailer, would you be good enough to continue, please?
Thank you. So
With
we're,
all due haste.
yes, yes, yes. Now let's look at the notices of rent increase filed with the rent program for fiscal years 2019 and 20 and 2020-21. So just as a bit of context, prior to the pandemic, in 2018-19, there were 2,476 rent increase notices filed with the rent program. Both fiscal years 2019-20 and 2021 saw decreases in notices filed. In 2019-20, there were 939 rent increase notices filed. This is a 62% decrease compared to the prior fiscal year. And in fiscal year 2020-21, only 233 rent increase notices were filed. That's a 90.5% decrease compared to the prior fiscal year. This precipitous drop in rent increase notices submitted to the rent program is a direct result of local and county-wide moratoriums on rent increases that were in effect until September 30th, 2021. After the rent increase moratorium went into effect, any notice of rent increase that was filed with the rent program resulted in both the landlord and tenant receiving a courtesy compliance letter informing them of their rights and responsibilities around the moratorium. Now, the economic impact of the pandemic experienced in both fiscal years resulted in a small drop in the consumer price index, also known as cost of living. The median increase for rent-controlled units in fiscal year 2019-20 dropped by $6 compared to fiscal year 2018-19, and in 2020-21, a decrease of $16 compared to fiscal year 2018-19. Despite both of these decreases in median rent increases, based on the many hundreds and thousands of counseling calls and cases we've had, we know that many households are still struggling to pay rent due to the negative financial impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, based on the information submitted to the rent program, the median new rent for rent-controlled units was $1,550 in fiscal year 2019-20. That was a $6 decrease compared to the prior fiscal year, and $1,400 for fiscal year 2020-21, a $119 decrease compared to fiscal year 2019-20. Now, this amount reflects data only for rent-controlled units. Now, all rental units covered under the rent ordinance must file termination of tenancy notices with the rent program. Now, in this map, you can see that there are some areas that are larger, these larger pink areas. And on this map, it indicates APNs, or areas where there were notices of termination of tenancies filed with the rent program. The larger apartments and developments, in other words, 5 units plus, filed the majority of termination notices. There was a lot around Hilltop and also in the Iron Triangle. In March of 2021, the City Council adopted Urgency Ordinance 0221, establishing a temporary moratorium on certain evictions of residential tenants in Richmond through the state and local emergency and then 60 days thereafter. The urgency ordinance prohibits evicting a tenant or requiring a tenant to vacate or representing to a tenant that the tenant is required to move out by law, notwithstanding a landlord's right to evict, for the following. The landlords can still evict under the urgency ordinance for nuisance that poses an imminent health and safety threat, or failure to pay rent that became due between March 1, 2020 and September 30th, 2021 pursuant the COVID-19 Tenant Relief Act, and for withdrawal of the rental unit from the rental market pursuant to the Ellis Act. The City of Richmond urgency ordinance has clearly led to a decrease in in the number of certain types of just cause evictions other than non-payment of rent, such as owner move-in evictions, and an overall decrease in termination of tenancy notices filed that were other than non-payment of rent. In the year prior to the pandemic, 2018-19, there were 148 just cause termination notices filed other than non-payment of rent. In 2019-20, that number dropped to 94, and that amounted to a decrease of 36.5 compared to the prior fiscal year. Now, with regard to 2021, there were 541 notices of termination of tenancy filed with the rent program. That is a decrease of approximately 87% compared to the prior fiscal year. And in fiscal year 2020-21, the number of other than non-payment of rent termination notices dropped from the 148 to 97. That was a decrease of 34.5% compared to that to the 2018-19 fiscal year. Now, this is likely the result of the fact that, there was a noticeable increase in nuisance and breach of lease notices filed with the rent program during fiscal year 2020-21 compared to fiscal year 2019-20. And this is presumably the result of the fact that evicting for nuisance, albeit nuisance that causes a threat to the health and safety of tenants or the landlord, was still allowed under the City of Richmond's urgency ordinance. So there were some landlords that utilized that option. There was a decrease in owner move-in evictions from 32 in fiscal year 2019-20 to 13 in fiscal year 2021, also likely a result of the city's urgency ordinance. Now, in both fiscal years 2019-20 and 2021, approximately 92% of notices of termination of tenancy filed with the rent program were for non-payment of rent. While this percentage trends similar to past fiscal years, the overall number of non-payment termination of tenancy notice submitted to the rent program decreased significantly. In fact, between June of 2019 and February of 2020, also known as the pre-pandemic period, the total number of non-payment of rent termination notices filed was 1,656. During the COVID-19 pandemic, March 2020 to June 2021, of course, we're not through it yet, but for the purposes of this report, that's what we're doing. 619 non-payment of rent termination of tenancy notices were filed, which is a total decrease of about 62%. The significant decrease in termination of tenancy for non-payment of rent was obviously related to the COVID-19 Tenant Relief Act, which became law in March of 2020, and which prohibited evictions for non-payment of rent for tenants who have experienced and declared financial hardship due to the COVID-19 pandemic, with, of course, the caveat that the tenant pays 25% of rent during the protected period. Now, there again, I do want to note that there is this notable increase in nuisance and breach of lease in 2020-21. I find this chart to be quite interesting because it shows you how the evictions were trending during the pandemic. So you can see from this chart, although there was a significant drop in non-payment of rent notices filed at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, 6 months after the pandemic began, landlords started issuing notices of termination of tenancy for non-payment of rent. Again, for those tenants who had not claimed COVID-19 pandemic related hardship. And excuse me, also proceeding with a non-payment of rent eviction during the COVID-19 pandemic did require landlords follow several more steps in the eviction process. And that included informing the tenant of their right, of some of their rights under the COVID-19 Tenant Protection Act. And based on many of the conversations that we had with landlords whose tenants were not paying rent, of the tenants who were served non-payment of rent notices after the state's eviction moratorium went into effect, many would receive the notice of termination of tenancy with the required information about their right to declare financial hardship. And many of them did claim financial hardship once they were aware of their right to do so, which presumably also kind of led to the drop. You see this spike in some months and then a drop the next month. And I think it's reasonable to assume that that partially had to do with the fact that there were a large number of notices being filed, and that then after that, the tenants asserted their rights under the Tenant Protection Act. Finally, I'd like to talk about something that is very important for the rent program and the rent board, and that's the financial stability of the rent program. I'm proud to say and be able to say that the rent program has progressively increased its compliance rate each fiscal year with regard to the payment of the rental housing fee, and has ended each year with reserves owing no money to City of Richmond. In 2019-20, there were $2.5 million in budgeted expenses, with $425,000 budgeted for reserves, with a total budget of $2.92 million. In 2019-20, the rent program ended the fiscal year with $2.26 million in actual expenses and $2.7 million in rental housing fee revenue collected, for a 92.6% compliance rate and a modest reserve of $441,000. In 2021, there was $2.48 million in budgeted expenses, $421,000 in budget reserves, with a total possible budget revenue of $2.9 million. In 2021, the rent program ended the fiscal year with $2.14 million in actual expenses and $2.8 million in rental housing fee revenue collected, resulting in a 96.5% compliance rate in terms of fees collected, and $653,000 contributed to the agency's reserves. And just for a bit of context, the first year we did our billing, our compliance rate was around 61%. So we've made a lot of progress. And with that, how's our timing? 8:23. The recommended action tonight is to receive and approve the fiscal year 2019-20 and fiscal year 2020-21 rent program annual report, and direct staff to present the report to the City Council. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions of any board members.
Any questions for Mr. Traylor? I don't.
We do have one public speaker, so.
All right, please call the
But I,
speaker.
but I see Board Member Vasilos has his hand up, so I don't know if you want to take the speaker first or you wanna-
Cynthia, I beg your pardon. What did you just say?
I'm not sure if you want to take the public speaker first, or do you want to hear from the board members?
Well, I'd prefer to hear from the board members first, but at this point, I'm not seeing anyone raise their hand or, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Vasilis. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just had a couple of questions. So talking about the loss of rental units portion, I know we've touched on this in a previous meeting. But we have Ellis Act evictions and owner move-in evictions as a very, very formal and expensive way to remove a property from the rental housing market. But there are plenty of other instances that don't involve, the $8,500 move back into your own house fee or the $16,500 Ellis Act fee, in which people would no longer want to be a rental housing provider. So I'm not saying that our data is inaccurate. I totally understand that we started at 25. I mean, I knew this back when we first started out in rent control, that 25,000 rental units is not really that accurate. So to go from that down 7,000 makes sense, but to assume that Ellis Act evictions and owner move-ins are the only way to determine loss in rental housing is equally as flawed. I think there needs to be a better way to monitor this and account for it. I'd like to see how many people fail to renew their rent fee because, let's say, they've sold their property or they no longer want to rent it out. There should be a better way to monitor that, just by, instead of just Ellis Act or owner move-in. And I know we had talked about that before, and I think it's something worth talking about, because if we're going to bring it up and say it's misinformation, we need to have a better way to determine whether or not we are losing rental housing. Because obviously, when we're talking about health and safety and the health of people, availability of housing is also very important. So if we're going to determine that, we need to find out if we're losing housing or not. I think that's it. I think one other question I had was about the reserves, and what, I mean, I'm a new board member. I'm sure this conversation's been had before, but considering the fact that the board can take from the city at any given time for financial support, I'm just questioning why we need to have a reserve account that's high, that is that high.
But we no longer have a reimbursement agreement with the city. They canceled it. They decided to no longer honor it. And that was a city council decision a year ago.
But I thought Measure L prevented such an action.
Well, the city council can take whatever action they want. We could try to force it and say, you need to save us if we were having financial issus.
It's a good question. The legal aspects of it, I will say, yeah, like Nick just said, if we ever went to court, would figure that out, the answer to that. But the city council voted, and they were very explicit when they voted. They singled us out for whatever reason, and they said they will not float us any money going forward. And that's what caused us to completely restructure. We used to bill later in the year, like around November, December. We had to start billing in June before the fiscal year started, so we have enough income in hand. We also have a reserve policy that requires us have a certain amount of cash on hand in the beginning of each fiscal year to make sure that there's no shortfall. But yeah, we're on our own. If we fall short, we're gonna have problems. So. And
then I think so, considering that your staff counsel, this would be essentially in the event that a lawsuit is filed and we lose, then whatever damages occurred would be coming out of that reserve account, something like that.
To be honest, it would be, I mean, we can discuss offline.
Yeah, that's probably a better use of that discussion, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then one last thing, just for clarity, there was an increase in fully covered units by, it seemed like a pretty huge amount. What can you explain that? Is that accounted for units or?
Well, these were units that were under the radar. And
So not an actual increase of housing, it's just an increase in accounted for rental.
yes, right, it's the latter. And they started, these landlords had been under the radar for years, started coming out of the woodwork. Because in order to evict, you have to be in compliance with the rent ordinance. So good luck going to court evicting your tenant who hasn't paid rent. And that's, they'd come and say, oh my God, I need to evict this tenant. I'm like, well, you haven't enrolled, you haven't paid the fee, you have to do that first. And we saw just the other day, there was like a 8-unit property that had tried to skirt under the radar for quite a while. And we had billed them every year, but some of them had been sent to collections, but they didn't finally pay the fees until they needed to.
Yeah.
They were forced to.
I mean, I think that's the problematic part of trying to account for gains or losses, right? Is you have to start at a certain base point of consistency of how many people are enrolled, and then just see if that drops or rises or whatnot. So it's a little hard to determine, but I think to be able to gauge for that in the future would be helpful. And then
Could I mention one other thing? We did discover a lot of ADUs, a lot of backyard units. So that 3,000 count includes those types of properties where it wasn't even in the city system.
that actually leads to my next question. So I thought ADUs were exempt.
If they're permitted.
Okay, so there's a lot of unpermitted ADUs. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Does
And then
the owner have to live in the unit, one of the units as well, for it to be exempt?
Yeah, in order for you to benefit from the full exemption afforded them under the rent ordinance, you have to occupy the main house. It had to have started as a single family home, and then you add a permitted ADU. And if the landlord lives in the main house and rents out the ADU is fully exempt from all aspects of the rent ordinance, rent control, just cause, everything. It's like it's not even in Richmond.
And then if the owner lives in their ADU and rents out the house, how is that treated?
The ADU would be exempt as owner occupied, and the house would be under rent control. Because it's no longer, it's a multi-unit property now.
But it also depends on when the house is built.
Yeah, that too.
Right?
If
So-
that house was built prior to.
Isn't that a little bit arbitrary though? I don't know. I might want to bring that up because if, let's say the owner doesn't need to have 1,800 square feet, they only need 900 square feet. They want to live in their ADU rather than their house, right? It's still following the purpose of having these ADU building codes, right? Is to create housing. So if that's not, if we're gonna, anyway, I'd like to bring that up at a different time. It just seems a little arbitrary that if the owner is living on the property, the fact that whether they're in the big house or the small house determines whether or not their property is rent controlled seems a little unusual. to me.
If you just allow me, I'll read the actual law. It says a unit that is lawful and in compliance with the small second unit ordinance of the city of Richmond will be exempt from this chapter, which is the rent ordinance, if the owner is the primary resident of the first larger single family home. So it's not
Okay.
arbitrary.
So it's in the MSRL itself.
That's right.
Okay, all right, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay,
That's it for me.
all right. Any further questions of Mr.
I
Turner?
have an announcement I wanted to make, and I severely, deeply apologize to board member Alana Grice Connor, because I did not mention her as one of the current board members at the beginning. She was listed here on the screen, but I don't know, I'm not perfect. I screwed up. Alana, will you forgive me?
You're not perfect? That is an announcement.
Good one.
Excuse me, we have 4 more minutes and we still need to hear from a speaker. Otherwise, we're going to be extending this
sorry.
meeting again.
Sorry, I lower my hand.
Anyone else? All right. Cynthia, would you be good enough to call the public speaker, please?
Yes, so Nicholas, you will have to change over the host to me, please.
Did we have a public speaker on this item?
Yes, I have to allow her to. speak.
Oh, okay,
So
thank
I'm
you.
waiting on him to change over the host.
Well, while you're doing that,
Mhm.
since it is 8:34, may I have another extension, please, for 10 minutes? Because we also want to get the reports from our officers. Excuse me, our staff. My apologies.
I'll
May I
make a
have a
motion.
motion?
I'll make a motion to extend for 10 minutes.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Okay, I'll second.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay,
Ms.
hold on. Okay, so Vasilas was the first.
So now we're going to go to 8:47.
To 8:47. Okay, let's take a vote. Board Member Connor,
Yes.
Board Member Johnson,
Yes.
Board Member Vasilas,
Yes.
Chair, Vice Chair Mishek,
Yes.
and Chair Finley.
Yes,
Okay, motion passes to extend the meeting, second extension to the meeting to 8:47. Passes unanimously. Okay, so I'll allow the speaker is Miss Alana Clark. You have 2 minutes to address the board. Go ahead, Alana.
Hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is regarding this last presentation. Nick, you mentioned that there was a protective measure to allow for habitability or property improvement rent raises, and I think it would be good to include how many of those raises have been granted by the rent board. Also on page 12 of your presentation, you mentioned the raises for 2019 and 2020, but you did not mention the allowable rent raise for 2021, which was 1.6%. And also in your counts of the evictions, I still don't see any distinction between the 3-day warning notices to pay or quit and an actual eviction notice that goes down that road beyond a simple warning letter. We've actually discussed this at previous rent board meetings, and I think it has been communicated to you that this is an important distinction to make, and it really skews your numbers when you do not make that distinction. I would also be interested, and I'm sure City Council would be interested to know if the rent program assisted anyone to access the rent assistance related to pandemic-related hardships. As we all know, rental assistance has been rolled out by the feds and the state and many localities, including Richmond. And it seems like that would be something that would really fall under the purvey of the Richmond rent program. And as we all know, both housing providers and renters need assistance in great numbers these days. And it would be good to know what role you've played in that. Finally, I'm going to strongly suggest that you really cut down the length of your time if you want to stay in the good graces of the City Council. Thank you very much.
Okay. Your time is up. Thank you.
thank you. Are there any further questions for Mr. Traylor? All right. Do we have a motion and a second?
I move that
And
that Executive Director Trailer present the 2020, 2019, the presentation to the City Council. It's the best I
So
can
are-
do. Sorry.
Are we approving that? So we are approving the presentation
I think
then
we
he-
receive the presentation and then give them instructions to present it to the city council.
All right. That instruction would mean that we do approve it since it's going to go to the city council. Thank you. May I have a second, please?
I second the motion.
Was that Ms. Johnson?
Vice
was-
Chair Mishik.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you, Ms. Mishik. May we have a vote, please?
Yes, Board Member Connor,
Yes.
Board Member Johnson,
Yes.
Board Member Vasilas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Mishek,
Yes.
and Chair Finley.
Yes.
Motion passes. Item I1 regarding the annual report passes unanimously.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is item J and the reports of officers. Are there any reports?
Mr. Trailer?
Only thing to report is that on Friday, we should be posting a Spanish version of the how to file a rent adjustment petition for both landlords and tenants. Other than that, nothing to report. And thank you, everybody, for your patience. I tried to read and go through this as quickly as possible, but 2 years, so it was hard to keep it short. Thank you for your patience and understanding.
Fine. Anyone else? In this case, I'm going to adjourn this meeting at 8:40 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Hey, take care, everybody.
Bye.